The pouring rain couldn't wash away the blood staining her ruined wedding dress. A desperate bride, miles from civilization, clutching a stolen revolver while fleeing a ruthless groom. She never guessed the treacherous mountain path would lead her straight into the arms of the territory's most dangerous, presumed dead outlaw. The heavy silk of the wedding gown felt less like a garment and more like a beautifully tailored coffin. Josephine Caldwell stood before the floor-to-length mirror in the opulent bridal suite of the Grand Hotel in Oakhaven, her breathing shallow against the rigid constraints of a whalebone corset. It was 1888, and in exactly 2 hours, she was to become the property of Jeremiah Preston, the wealthiest and most merciless cattle baron in the territory. Josephine had not chosen this life. 6 months prior, her beloved father, Thomas Caldwell, had suddenly fallen violently ill, passing away in a matter of days and leaving the sprawling, fiercely independent Caldwell Ranch entirely in debt to Preston's bank. Jeremiah had offered a simple, predatory ultimatum: marry him or see her family's legacy auctioned off to the highest bidder, leaving her and her younger siblings destitute. But the tragedy of her father's death had unraveled into a nightmare just an hour ago. Seeking a moment of quiet, Josephine had slipped into Jeremiah's private study downstairs. She was only looking for a pen to write a final letter to her sister, but a misplaced ledger on his mahogany desk caught her eye. Tucked inside its pages was a receipt from a traveling apothecary in Denver, a receipt for arsenic, dated exactly 3 weeks before her father's sudden, agonizing decline. Pinned to it was a handwritten note from Jeremiah's foreman. The old man took the dose in his whiskey. "The ranch is yours, boss. Just secure the girl." The sheer horror of the revelation had paralyzed her, but only for a moment. Survival instinct, honed by years of riding the wild frontier with her father, kicked in. Josephine didn't scream. She didn't weep. She quietly walked to Jeremiah's glass display case, shattered it with a heavy brass paperweight, and took his prized Colt .45 revolver, shoving it into the deep, hidden pocket of her skirts. Her escape was a blur of frantic motion. Avoiding the main lobby, she slipped through the hotel's kitchen, the heavy silk of her train dragging through spilled flour and soot. She stole a horse, tethered in the back alley, a massive, ill-tempered roan gelding that belonged to one of Jeremiah's deputies. She didn't bother with a saddle, riding bareback, her white skirts billowing like a ghost against the flanks of the beast as she spurred him out of the town limits, just as the first crack of thunder signaled an approaching tempest. By nightfall, the Bitterroot Mountains had swallowed her whole. The storm that broke over the jagged peaks was of biblical proportions. Rain lashed at her face in freezing, horizontal sheets, turning the dirt trails into treacherous rivers of thick, sucking mud. The roan gelding fought her every step of the way, its eyes rolling in terror as lightning violently illuminated the pines. Josephine was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue, her hands completely numb, where they gripped the horse's mane. The wedding dress, once a marvel of imported French lace, was now a heavy, sodden trap of mud, torn fabric, and the blood from her palms, which had been rubbed raw by the coarse horsehair. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder shook the very bedrock beneath them. Lightning struck a dead pine mere yards away, exploding the trunk into fiery splinters. The roan screamed, rearing up on its hind legs. Josephine, exhausted and freezing, lost her grip. She was thrown backward, tumbling down a steep embankment of shale and wet earth. She landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, her head striking a submerged root. For a long time, she lay there in the freezing mud, the rain violently beating against her back. The horse was gone. She was alone, miles from any town, with a murderer undoubtedly gathering a posse to hunt her down. Forcing herself to her hands and knees, Josephine crawled. Her survival depended entirely on finding shelter. She dragged herself up the embankment, leaving a trail of torn white lace in the brush. She stumbled blindly through the dense timber, guided only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. Just as her vision began to narrow with the black edges of severe hypothermia, she saw it. It wasn't a building, not exactly. It was a faint, warm orange glow, emanating from a fissure in the solid granite wall of a towering cliff face. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Josephine staggered toward the light. As she drew closer, the structure revealed itself, a masterful piece of frontier camouflage. A heavy timber cabin had been built directly into the deep recess of the cavern, its roof flush with the overhanging rock, making it entirely invisible from the valley below or the ridge above. She reached the heavy oak door, her blooded hands desperately clawing at the wood. She managed one weak, pathetic knock before her legs finally gave out. Josephine collapsed against the threshold, the darkness entirely consuming her as she heard the distinct, terrifying sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding back. The heat was the first thing to pull Josephine from the abyss, a dry, radiating warmth that smelled distinctly of burning hickory, strong chicory coffee, and oiled leather. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. She was lying on a makeshift cot covered in thick, coarse wolf pelts. Her ruined wedding dress had been removed, replaced by an oversized, heavy flannel shirt that dwarfed her frame. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her chest. She reached frantically for her side, searching for the stolen colt, but her weapon was gone. Looking for this? A deep, gravelly voice echoed from the corner of the room. Josephine scrambled backward against the rough-hewn log wall, pulling the pelts up to her chin. Sitting by the stone hearth, methodically cleaning her stolen revolver with a rag, was a man who looked like he had been carved directly from the unforgiving mountain rock. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark, unkempt hair that brushed the collar of his faded canvas duster. A rugged, unshaven jawline was interrupted by a pale, jagged scar that ran from his left cheekbone down to his neck, the kind of scar left by a hunting knife. But it was his eyes that terrified her the most. They were a piercing, stormy grey, entirely devoid of warmth, analyzing her with the calculating stillness of a predator. "Who are you?" Josephine demanded, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Where are my clothes?" "Your clothes were frozen solid and covered in mud and blood. You were 10 minutes away from freezing to death on my porch," the man replied, his tone flat, entirely unbothered by her panic. He set the revolver down on a wooden crate. "As for who I am, I'm the man who just saved your life. The better question is, what is a woman in a $10,000 silk gown doing climbing the Devil's Tooth Ridge in the middle of a flash flood?" Josephine swallowed hard. "I got lost. My horse threw me." The man let out a low, humorless scoff. He stood up, towering over the room. He walked over to a small wooden table, poured a steaming mug of black coffee, and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, wrapping her freezing, bandaged hands around the hot tin. "People don't just get lost up here, lady," he said, leaning against the timber support beam. "This trail hasn't been used since the gold rush of '75, and they certainly don't get lost carrying a customized Colt Peacemaker with the initials JP engraved on the ivory handle." Josephine flinched. He noticed. "Jeremiah Preston," the man said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. His eyes narrowed. "You're his runaway bride. The whole territory's been talking about the grand wedding in Oakhaven. So, why did the future queen of the Preston Empire run away into a thunderstorm?" "That is none of your business," she snapped, finding a sliver of her Caldwell defiance. "I just need a horse. I'll pay you whatever you want. When I get to Denver—" "You won't make it to Denver," he interrupted coldly. "Preston has 50 men on his payroll. Trackers, bounty hunters, killers. If you stole his horse and his gun and humiliated him at the altar, he isn't sending men to bring you back, sweetheart. He's sending men to bury you." "He killed my father!" Josephine shouted, the sudden outburst surprising even herself. Tears of exhaustion and grief finally spilled over her lashes. "He poisoned my father to steal our ranch. I found the proof today. I couldn't marry the man who murdered my family." The cabin fell deathly silent. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside the heavy door and the crackle of the fire. The man stared at her, the hostility in his grey eyes slowly fracturing into something resembling shock. He pushed off the wooden beam and stepped closer into the light. "Thomas Caldwell?" he asked, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. "You're Tom Caldwell's daughter." Josephine blinked, wiping her face with the oversized flannel sleeve. "You knew my father?" The man didn't answer immediately. He walked over to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, threw open the heavy lid, and pulled out a tarnished 6-point silver star. He tossed it onto the cot beside her. Josephine picked it up. Engraved on the metal were the words, "Sheriff, Oakhaven County." 3 years ago, I was the law in Oakhaven, the man said softly, staring into the flames. "Name's Bo Montgomery. Your father was one of the only honest ranchers left in the valley. We were working together to prove that Preston was rustling cattle and murdering homesteaders who wouldn't sell to his bank." Josephine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Bo Montgomery, but you're dead. The papers said you were gunned down in an ambush by outlaws." "Preston's outlaws," Bo corrected bitterly. "They ambushed me at the gorge, put a bullet in my shoulder, and left me to drown in the river. I survived, crawled up this mountain, and built this place. I've been a ghost ever since, watching Preston steal the town, waiting for the right moment to tear his empire down. I thought your father abandoned the fight when I died. I didn't know Preston killed him." A profound, heavy realization settled between them. The runaway bride and the ghost sheriff. They were two casualties of the same tyrant, brought together by a cruel twist of fate and a violent mountain storm. Bo looked at her, truly looking at her this time. He saw the fierce, unyielding spark in her eyes, the same spark he used to admire in old Tom Caldwell. "You found the proof, the actual receipt." "Yes," Josephine said, her voice steadying. "It's sewn into the lining of the dress you took off me." Bo walked over to the hearth, picking up the ruined, muddy mass of white silk. With a sharp pocket knife, he sliced open the bodice lining, extracting the folded, water-stained apothecary receipt and the foreman's note. He read them over, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his scarred face. "This is it," Bo whispered, a terrifying glint of vengeance in his eyes. "This is the rope we use to hang him." Before Josephine could reply, the deep, resonant baying of a bloodhound echoed through the thick timber walls, cutting through the sound of the storm. Bo's smile vanished. He extinguished the oil lantern in a second, plunging the cabin into the dim, flickering light of the hearth. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from the mantel, throwing the lever down with a sharp, metallic clack. "They found the horse," Bo muttered, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. "Get up, Josephine. We have company." The heavy oak door rattled under the sheer force of the mountain gale, but it was the unnatural sounds that made Josephine's blood run entirely cold, the frantic, wet scrabbling of boots on loose shale, the low, guttural growl of a tracking hound, and then the unmistakable metallic click of a revolver hammer being pulled back in the torrential rain outside. Beau Montgomery moved with the lethal, silent grace of a mountain lion. He tossed Josephine her stolen Colt .45. She caught it awkwardly, her bandaged hands protesting, but she gripped the ivory handle with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. "Keep away from the windows," Beau whispered, his voice a low rumble, barely audible over the roaring fireplace. He slipped a bandolier of heavy Winchester cartridges over his broad shoulders. "Preston uses a tracker named Elias Higgins. He's a former Pinkerton agent who was fired for his cruelty. If Higgins is out there, he hasn't come to negotiate." "Higgins," Josephine breathed, the name sending a spike of dread through her chest. It was Higgins whose signature was at the bottom of the murderous note hidden in her dress. "He's the foreman. He's the one who slipped the arsenic into my father's whiskey." Beau's jaw tightened, the jagged scar on his cheek pulling taut in the dim firelight. "Then he's not leaving this mountain." "Hey, in the cabin!" A raspy, booming voice echoed from the darkness beyond the porch. It was Higgins. "We know you're in there. The hound tracked the bride's scent right to your stoop. Send the Caldwell girl out, and whoever is hiding her gets to live to see tomorrow's sunrise. Keep her inside, and we burn this little rat hole to the ground with you both in it." Beau didn't bother answering. He leveled his Winchester through a narrow firing slit, carved into the heavy window shutter. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, spitting a foot-long tongue of orange flame into the pitch-black night. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the tree line, followed by the heavy thud of a man hitting the mud. "Kill them!" Higgins screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "Tear it down!" The night erupted into chaos. A hail of lead slammed into the cabin, turning the thick timber walls into a deafening drum of splintering wood and ricocheting bullets. Josephine dropped to her hands and knees, crawling behind the heavy stone hearth as glass shattered and clay mugs exploded off the shelves. "There are at least 6 of them," Beau called out calmly, working the lever of his rifle with rhythmic, devastating precision. Every time he fired, a man outside either screamed or scrambled for thicker cover. But the posse had the advantage of the dark, and the cabin was a glowing target. Suddenly, a heavy thud landed on the cedar-shingled roof. Then another. Josephine looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" "Kerosene jugs," Beau grunted, slamming fresh cartridges into the loading gate of his rifle. "They're going to smoke us out." Seconds later, a Molotov cocktail shattered against the front porch. The flames caught instantly, roaring to life despite the driving rain, fueled by the thick layer of pine needles and dry kindling Beau had stored outside. Thick, acrid black smoke began to pour through the floorboards and the cracks in the walls. "We can't stay here," Josephine choked out, coughing as the smoke quickly filled the confined space. "I know," Beau said, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. He dragged her toward the back of the cabin, where the structure met the solid granite of the mountain cavern. He threw aside a heavy Navajo rug, revealing a trapdoor constructed of thick iron and wood. "I didn't spend 3 years up here just waiting to die," Beau said, heaving the door open to reveal a pitch-black tunnel carved directly into the mountain fissure. "This leads to an old silver mining shaft on the other side of the ridge. Move!" Josephine scrambled down the wooden ladder into the damp, freezing darkness of the tunnel. Beau followed closely behind, but not before grabbing the ruined remnants of her wedding dress and the precious apothecary receipt. He slammed the trapdoor shut and dropped a heavy iron crossbar into place just as the cabin's front door gave way with a splintering crash. They could hear Higgins shouting above them, his boots stomping on the floorboards as the fire raged. "Find her! Check the back!" Beau lit a single sulfur match, illuminating the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel. The air down here was ancient and smelled of wet earth and oxidized copper. "Stay close," he whispered, holding the match up to guide them. It's a half-mile walk to the exit, and the supports are rotting." For what felt like hours, they navigated the treacherous, winding mine shaft. Josephine's bare feet, now wrapped tightly in strips of burlap Bo had provided, ached with every step over the sharp gravel. Yet, she didn't complain. The proximity to Bo, his broad back serving as her only shield against the terrifying darkness, ignited a strange, fierce sense of safety within her. This man, a legendary lawman presumed dead, was risking everything for her. "Why did you save me?" Josephine asked softly, the acoustics of the tunnel carrying her voice. Bo paused, lighting a fresh match, the tiny flame reflected in his stormy grey eyes as he looked back at her. "Because for 3 years, I've watched Jeremiah Preston destroy everything decent in Oakhaven. I watched him take your father's life, and I couldn't stop it. I'll be damned if I let him take yours too." Josephine held his gaze, a profound, unspoken understanding passing between them. They were no longer just a runaway bride and a ghost. They were the reckoning. They finally reached the exit, a concealed cave mouth hidden behind a waterfall of mountain runoff. Dawn was just beginning to break over the bitter roots, painting the stormy sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. Hidden in a small corral near the cave mouth were 2 sturdy Mustang horses, fully tacked and ready. "We ride for Oakhaven," Bo said, securing his rifle to the saddle. Josephine touched the hidden pocket of his duster, where the forged receipt and foreman's confession safely rested. "We're going straight back into the lion's den?" Bo mounted his horse, a dangerous, wolfish grin spreading across his face. "No, we're bringing the lion out into the street." The town of Oakhaven was gripped by a tense, suffocating quiet when Josephine and Bo rode onto the main street at high noon the following day. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sweltering, humid heat that baked the mud ruts into solid clay. Jeremiah Preston's men had not yet returned from the mountain, leaving the town relatively unguarded. Preston himself was holding court inside the Grand Hotel's saloon, undoubtedly celebrating his hostile takeover of the Caldwell Ranch, convinced his bride was dead at the bottom of a ravine. They didn't go to the local sheriff's office. The current badge wearer was firmly in Preston's pocket. Instead, Bo led Josephine to the telegraph office. Sitting behind the desk, nursing a cup of black coffee, was a man whose presence in Oakhaven was a closely guarded secret. It was Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas, a legendary, uncorruptible federal lawman who had arrived in town 2 days prior under the guise of a cattle buyer to investigate missing federal payroll shipments. Bo walked in, kicking the door shut behind him. Marshal Thomas went for his sidearm, but stopped dead when he saw Bo's face. "I'll be a son of a gun," Thomas whispered, slowly standing up. "Bo Montgomery, we dragged the river for you." "You didn't drag deep enough, Heck," Bo replied, stepping aside to reveal Josephine. "I brought you a witness, and the evidence you need to hang Jeremiah Preston." Josephine stepped forward, placing the water-stained apothecary receipt and Higgins' handwritten confession on the telegraph desk. Marshal Thomas read the documents carefully, his expression hardening into stone. "Conspiracy, murder, and federal land theft," Thomas muttered, tapping the paper. "This is a federal hanging offense. But Preston has 20 armed men drinking in the saloon across the street. A piece of paper won't stop a bullet. That's why I'm going in first," Bo said, checking the cylinder of his revolver. "I'll draw his fire and his attention. You secure the perimeter with your federal deputies. Josephine stays here." "No," Josephine interrupted, her voice ringing out with absolute authority. Both men turned to look at her. She stood tall, no longer the terrified girl in the ruined silk dress. She was the rightful heir to the Caldwell legacy. "He killed my father. He tried to sell me like livestock. I am not hiding in a telegraph office while you fight my battle, Bo." Bo looked at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of immense pride and terrifying fear for her safety. He nodded once. "Stay behind me." The doors of the Grand Hotel saloon swung open with a loud, violent crash. The piano player stopped dead. The laughter of the cattle barons and hired guns instantly evaporated. Jeremiah Preston, a striking, aristocratic man with slicked-back silver hair and a tailored broadcloth suit, stood at the mahogany bar. He turned around, his whiskey glass halting halfway to his mouth. The color drained entirely from Preston's face as he stared at the ghost walking toward him. "Montgomery," Preston choked out, his voice cracking. "You're dead." "I crawled out of hell to return the favor, Jeremiah," Bo said, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. Then Josephine stepped out from behind Bo's broad shoulder. She was dressed in rugged mountain clothes, her father's stolen Colt .45 gripped firmly in her hand, aimed squarely at Preston's chest. "And I came to take my ranch back," Josephine declared, her voice steady and echoing with vengeance. Preston's shock quickly morphed into a cornered, venomous rage. He dropped his whiskey glass, his hand darting beneath his tailored coat for his hidden derringer. "Kill them!" he screamed to his remaining men. But Bo was faster. The ghost sheriff drew his revolver with blinding, impossible speed. The roar of his weapon was deafening in the enclosed saloon. Preston's shoulder blew out in a spray of crimson, spinning the corrupt cattle baron violently into the bar before he collapsed to the floor, screaming in agony. The hired guns in the room hesitated, reaching for their holsters. But before a single gun could be drawn, the front windows of the saloon shattered. Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas and 4 federal deputies leveled double-barreled shotguns through the broken glass, cocking the hammers in terrifying unison. "By the authority of the United States government," Marshal Thomas bellowed, "any man who draws a weapon dies where he stands." The hired guns slowly, carefully raised their hands, dropping their gun belts to the floor. The reign of terror in Oakhaven was over in less than 60 seconds. Josephine walked slowly across the floorboards, standing over the bleeding, pathetic form of Jeremiah Preston. She looked down at the man who had caused her family so much pain, feeling nothing but profound pity. "The federal marshal has the apothecary receipt, Jeremiah," Josephine said coldly, looking down the barrel of her Colt. "And the note from Higgins. You're going to hang in a federal penitentiary." She uncocked her revolver, holstering it, and turned her back on him forever. With Preston's empire dismantled by federal law, the Caldwell Ranch was rightfully restored to Josephine. She didn't rule it alone, however. Bo Montgomery pinned the silver sheriff's star back onto his chest, restoring peace to the valley alongside the brave runaway bride who had captured his heavily guarded heart. Their story became a frontier legend, a testament to the fact that even the darkest mountain storms can forge the strongest of steel.